Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska. Mobile phone and tablet usage is on the rise, and Market Journal is ready to provide these users with the latest agricultural information. The Market Journal mobile app is now available for iPads and smartphones, such as iPhones and Android devices. By using the app, users will have the option to view current and archived program segments with the touch of a finger.
2 major shipping ports for goods moving to China, Japan.
The end-of-day futures prices are available each day to help crop and livestock producers with their marketing plans. Users can even select their local grain elevators in the state to identify current prices. Underneath the News tab, several up-to-the-minute ag stories are available from Market Journal, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and UNL's Crop Watch. The mobile app will identify the location of users' devices using GPS technologies to provide local weather conditions. Within the mobile app, users can learn more about the Market Journal show and learn about the program team and regular guests. The iPhone and Android versions of the app allow users to submit their agricultural photos and ask questions of the program's experts, which may be addressed on future programs. For Apple devices such as iPhones and iPads, the free app is available through iTunes. The Market Journal mobile app is also available through the Google Play mobile app store for Android devices.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, Ron Plain is our marketing analyst. Dennis Conley looks at fuel prices, Stephen Wegulo advises treatment for wheat diseases, and we'll show you one of the biggest biodiesel production facilities in the country. We start in the hog markets. In the latest quarterly hogs and pigs report, the USDA said all inventory was up, but only by 2% from March of 2011. When we talked to University of Missouri Extension ag economist Ron Plain on Tuesday, we asked if he was surprised by such a low number of growth.
Well, if you look at the pig report, it's sort of a bad news, good news story. The total inventory up 2% was a bit higher than what I was expecting. But on the flip side, farrowing intentions for spring and summer combined down over 1% was lower than I was expecting. So in the short term, maybe a few more hogs than we thought, but longer term, second half of the year into 2013, looks like there's not going to be as much growth as we'd thought there would be.
So what do you think the reasons are behind that, Ron? Because when we talked, a month or two ago, we thought that the prices were supportive enough that we might see growth in the farrowing sector.
I think it's been a risk factor largely. A lot of volatility in the markets and a lot of concern about feed costs. We've had record corn prices at times over the winter season. So left a lot of producers uneasy, and I think that caused them to scale back some of their growth plans.
What are your thoughts on inputs now? Corn report, or the prospective plantings numbers last week showed that the acres for corn were going to be up, but the stocks were down. So in terms of input costs, are those going to remain high over the summer?
Well, it looks like, sort of the same sort of story. The stocks, how much corn we have on hand is tight, and that's going to keep short-term prices up. But prospective plantings are huge, up 4% from a year ago, most acres since 1937. So that should give us a good harvest and plenty of corn in 2013. So the story is continued high corn prices, but then a pretty fast drop-off should come during the summer, and quite a bit cheaper prices come fall.
Right, and as you mentioned before we talked on air, some people in Missouri, or a decent number in Missouri, are already starting to plant corn.
Yes.
The profit margin, it's going to be good this summer, or at least better than it has been, correct?
Yes, well, seasonally, hog prices are normally at their highest of the year during late spring and summer. We expect that to be the case this year, and in fact may hold a little better in late summer than normal. So some good profit margins are in the weeks and months ahead of us. Always the fourth quarter of the year is the toughest quarter, and with the falling corn prices that we should get, if the weather cooperates, then profit margins may shrink, but still not be as bad as normal in November and December.
On the show here, we've been talking about packer margins when it comes to the cattle markets and how much money they're losing, but the packers in the pig markets aren't making any money either.
That's true. If you look at carcass prices for hogs, has been running 100, 101, 102% of the cutout value, which means packer margins very, very tight. It was not a good first quarter for hog packers. At some point in time, they're going to figure out some way to get their margins back, and that'll probably mean a tad bit lower hog prices than otherwise.
Yeah, and do you have a feeling on that, Ron, as to how far they can stomach it?
Well, you know, as we move into summer, normally the number of hogs slaughtered on a daily basis declines, so it's going to be a tough challenge for hog packers to generate much improvement. It could well last to mid-year before we see a real turnaround in packer margins.
Give me your thoughts as far as the consumer goes as to what they'll be seeing in the meat counter or over the meat counter.
Well, per capita meat supplies is going to be down 3, maybe 4 pounds per person this year. That's going to mean continued high prices for poultry and red meats in the grocery store, so not a great time to be a shopper.
Yeah. Overall, though, as if you're a farmer and you're producing pigs, a good time for them?
Yes, it looks like a fairly good outlook following the pig report and the prospective plantings, lower feed costs, and not much of an increase in hog numbers, so it should be a pretty good time to be in the hog business.
Next week, we'll take a look at cattle markets with Mike Briggs. When we reported last week on lean, finely textured beef, we assumed concerns from consumers would have an impact in the cattle world. But those fears, coupled with already negative margins, throttled cattle packers into the deep red. For the last week in March, the Sterling Beef Profit Tracker says on average, packers lost nearly $97 per head. In related news, a USDA spokesperson says some companies have voluntarily asked to label meat containing lean, finely textured beef. E15 made another step towards widespread availability this week. The Environmental Protection Agency will allow the makers of the 15% blend to register as suppliers. While it's a win for the ethanol industry, the blend still has another round of testing before suppliers face the task of convincing marketers to sell it at their stations. The Obama administration has set a goal of helping to install 10,000 blender pumps in the country over the next 5 years. And right now, anything that can help the gasoline industry would be a huge benefit to those behind the wheel. When we talked with UNL Ag Economics professor Dennis Conley on Wednesday, the national gasoline average was $3.94 per gallon. We asked Dennis how this year compares to history and what the worst-case scenario would be for drivers, but started by asking about the typical movement gasoline takes during the course of a calendar year.
If we look at the seasonality of gas prices, say over the last 5 years, what we notice is starting near the end of February, the first part of March, up through the end of May, Memorial Weekend, prices generally increase. From that point on then, through the summer months, they level off for a couple of months, and then by mid-July, early August, they start to decline going into the fall and winter season. This is intuitive, I think everybody understands. You know, school's out, going on vacation, it's summertime, a lot of driving. Then you go into the fall, you know, people go back to work, less driving, and so on.
Now, how does that compare to what we're seeing? We're only in April, but how does it compare to what we've seen so far through the first 3 months and what you think we'll see as we go forward?
Yeah, if we look back historically over the last 5 years, you know, we have on a monthly average, we have a low set of prices shown by the green line. We have an average set shown by the black line, and we have the highest of the month shown by the blue line. What's happening in 2012 is, because of supply, demand, and other conditions, that the price is running about 25 cents a gallon higher. This is a Midwest average retail gasoline price.
Does it feel like it's higher than that even, because we can still remember when gas was below $2?
It feels like it because if we go back historically and we look at gasoline prices, there was about a 20-year time period from 1986 to about 2006 when we had very ample supplies of crude oil and liquid fuels in the world. And so we had relatively low prices and ample supply, and that we all got used to that. I actually call that SUV heaven. It's when you saw a lot of SUVs, you see a lot of pickup trucks, you know. People didn't worry about the price of gas. But in 2006, the world began to change.
So what's the concern this year? Why are we so high so early right now?
We're high because there's a concern that two things. The demand has caught up with the supply. That really started in about 2006, where the fundamentals demand caught up with supply. China was part of that. But the other concern that we see now is worry about geopolitical events. And there are those of us who have historical memories going clear back to the 1970s. 1978 was when there was a revolution in Iran. And when that government turned over, their world supply of crude oil was no longer available. And that had a major impact on prices back then.
I think what some of the question is now is people are going to say there's plenty of supply. There's ample supply. Why are prices so high if there's nothing going on? Yeah. Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question. You look at the fundamentals, and yes, there is ample supply. There's ample supply in the U.S., there's ample supply in the world. But what happens with consumers of liquid fuels and crude oil is they get concerned with geopolitical events that maybe a month from now or 2 months from now or 6 months from now, those supplies, those regular sources of supply will not be there. Countries like Japan, Europe, places that are entirely dependent on other parts of the world for their energy, so they'll go out and in anticipation of problems, they will buy crude oil and liquid fuels in advance, and that bids up the prices, even though the fundamentals say we still have plenty of crude oil and liquid fuels around.
And when does that end? When does that anticipation end? Because right now we're in April. The election doesn't end until November, so that's another part of it. But Iran, whether or not U.S. or Israel action takes place, who knows when that's going to be?
That's exactly right, and that's the answer to your question. You tell me when that's going to be, and I'll tell you when the prices will start to moderate. These geopolitical events, that's the uncertainty that comes with them. And with that uncertainty, that's why these countries and users want to acquire the supply now, so that they're never short, and that they're getting at the price now versus a higher price later. If say the geopolitical events like Iran, and we've all heard about that in the news, if that moderates and it looks less threatening, then they'll back off on their anticipated demand, and we'll see the prices then come back to a more normal range.
You mentioned demand and consumers. How much is being consumed by drivers across this country and the world?
If we start with the world, we're talking about 89 million barrels per day of liquid fuels consumption. That's gasoline, heating oil, fuel oil, jet fuel, all of those things. 89 million barrels per day. The U.S. Consumes about 18 million barrels per day. That's down 10% from what we did 5 years ago. China, on the other hand, consumes 10 million barrels per day, about half of what we do in the U.S. Their consumption over the last 5 years is up by 66%. The rest of the world's consumption, at about 55 million barrels per day, is up by about 10%. So you got China is the big consumer that's growing. You got the rest of the world that's growing, but you have the U.S. that, because of conservation and more efficiency and driving and things like that, our consumption is actually down.
Give me a worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario when we talk about prices?
The worst case scenario, and again, this is like a weather forecast, is it going to rain or be a thunderstorm or what have you, but the worst case scenario, in my view, would be that we continue to have geopolitical events that threaten the normal channels of supply sources, Persian Gulf, Straits of Hormuz, Iran, and who knows where else. If those conditions evolve like they did back in the late 1970s, we're talking about gasoline maybe in Lincoln this summer being $4 to $4.25 a gallon. If that worst case scenario develops, $5 is not out of the question, and maybe even higher.
While gas prices continue to hit consumers from coast to coast, the Business Conditions Index shows that 9 states in the Mid-America region continue to strengthen their economy. The Creighton University study showed a rising index for the 5th consecutive month, this time increasing by 0.2 to 58.6. The index runs from 0 to 100, with a number over 50 indicating an expansionary economy over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. According to the USDA, about 1.8% of all privately owned agricultural land in the country is foreign-owned. Some states, including Nebraska, restrict foreign ownership. However, about 1/100% of land in the state is foreign-owned. University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension Ag Law Specialist David Aiken explains the exceptions to foreign land ownership.
There are some big exceptions. Land within a city or village or within 3 miles of a city or village. So, in urban areas, there's no restrictions. Manufacturing and industrial facilities, including petroleum facilities and oil and gas leases, those are all exempt. Railroads, public utilities, and common carriers. Land acquired through loan foreclosure, although that land has to be sold within 10 years, and then inheritances, but then they also must be sold within 5 years.
From Nebraska's portion of foreign-owned land, over half of that is found in Dixon County, but most or all of that land is mineral leases and not land ownership. Aiken says Lincoln, Lancaster, Cheyenne, and Washington counties are the only areas with more than 1,000 acres of foreign-owned or leased land. Compared to last year, wheat across the state is faring much better, but UNL Extension plant pathologist Stephen Wegulo says it's now time to start scouting for disease in this year's crop.
We are seeing already in southeast Nebraska, we are seeing leaf spots and powder mildew. And just last week, we had reports of leaf rust and stripe rust in Kansas. So that means we may see the rust diseases here in Nebraska a little earlier than we usually see them.
So what does that mean in terms of treating them and moving the applications up?
That means growers need to get out and scout their fields to make sure that they are not missing anything, because if they detect these diseases early enough, then they can make management decisions in a timely manner so that these diseases don't do a lot of damage to their fields.
Is fusarium head blight been a problem this year?
It's hard to tell at this time, but if there is moisture just before flowering, because fusarium head blight infects wheat at flowering, if there is moisture before and during flowering, then we could see fusarium head blight. But at this time, it's not. It's a little way ahead to tell. We have the fusarium head blight risk assessment tool, which is an internet-based forecasting system. And folks who can go onto the internet and see the forecast for fusarium head blight, usually starting about 10 days to 14 days before flowering.
Now the field we're in is perfectly green, but there has been some concern over some yellowing in wheat and fields across the state. What's the diagnosis?
Well, we have been seeing yellow fields about this time of year, and that has been pretty normal, but especially in clay soils. In those kinds of situations, nitrogen tends to be tied up, and so the wheat crop just doesn't get enough of the nitrogen, and the field looks yellow, and usually the wheat will grow out of that condition. But we also are seeing some virus diseases, especially soil-borne mosaic virus, wheat streak mosaic virus, and also there is a new virus known as triticum mosaic virus. We have seen those viruses, all those 3 viruses in samples that were submitted to the clinic from southeast Nebraska.
And what can be done in that situation then, Stephen?
Once you have virus diseases in the field, there is nothing that can be done in the current growing season. But you can do some things later in the fall or before planting that can help to minimize the damage caused by viruses. For example, wheat streak mosaic virus is favored by lots of volunteer wheat. And so before planting in the fall, just make sure that you kill all the volunteer weed in the field and around the field, and that will help to minimize the damage caused by wheat streak mosaic virus.
Again, Wegulo says because of unseasonably warm temperatures in winter and spring, the wheat crop is about 2 weeks ahead of normal, so growers need to move up their scouting schedules accordingly. Nebraska landowners have been fighting eastern red cedar for years, but most of the time it's a losing battle. The April Nebraska Farmer cover story describes how Boyd County residents are going after this rangeland pest. Led by Gerald Dennis and Todd Nelson, a group of producers works together on prescribed burns. Landowners have taken advantage of the USDA's Environmental Quality Incentives Program because controlling red cedar is now an eligible cost-sharing practice under the program. You can read more about the group's effort in the April Nebraska Farmer. We recently showed you how Nebraska soybeans reached international buyers through ports along the Pacific coast. While on our trip to Washington with Nebraska soybean growers, we also saw one of the largest biodiesel production facilities in the nation, Imperium Renewables.
Situated on just less than 13 acres of ground at the Port of Grays Harbor, Imperium Renewables produces unblended B100 biodiesel for buyers in this country and outside it. With the capability to make 100 million gallons per year, this is the second largest biodiesel production facility in the U.S. 14 tanks and 18 million gallons of storage dominate the intricate pattern it takes to get feedstocks, such as soy, in and biodiesel back out. Completed in 2007, this facility connects together with roughly 70,000 linear feet of piping. It's also the only biodiesel facility that has the advantage of being trimodal. It can export via rail, truck, or water. The biodiesel industry continues to grow in the United States. It produced over 1 billion gallons in 2011. But the biggest buyer for Imperium Renewables lies just to the north, Canada. We saw in December how New York City was turning to biodiesel to power city vehicles and bioheat to warm homes. Overall, biodiesel gives soybean oil a much-needed use and an added value. Biodiesel has an energy balance of 5.5 to 1, meaning that for every unit of energy used to make biodiesel, 5.5 units of energy are gained. That makes it the most efficient fuel on the market. And as we've now seen in New York City and Grays Harbor, the impressive infrastructure is producing a product with increasing demand.
The next crop of Nebraska soybeans that may eventually be used in biodiesel will soon be in the ground, or already is in the ground depending on where you are. A UNL Extension educator said this week 2/4 of beans are already up in the northeast part of the state. Now to show what conditions planters could expect this week, here's UNL Extension statewide climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again on Friday morning. Of course, the big news this week was the upper air low that moved through the central plains, particularly across Kansas. We've seen some significant moisture across Kansas. We've seen some significant tornadic activity around the Dallas-Fort Worth into northeastern Texas. For Nebraska proper, we were on the northern periphery of that spinning upper air low as it slowly moved its way eastward. And so southern Nebraska was the beneficiary of the precipitation, particularly those border counties right along the Kansas-Nebraska intersect. And as you got north of there, the precipitation totals dropped off rather dramatically. We were looking at around an inch totals, pretty common across the southern border region. As you got up the Interstate 80 corridor, precipitation totals dropped off into the 1/4 to 1/2 inch range, and there was another pocket that developed from Grand Island up to Ord where we also seen the same type of pattern. Now, east of there and west of there, no significant moisture, if at all, just a few sprinkles. So our precipitation deficits continue to increase, and we're starting to get very, very concerned because we should be getting a 1/2 inch right now per week. By the end of April, we'll be up to 3/4 of an inch. So each week we go without precipitation, those deficits increase rather dramatically. There was a hard freeze in the eastern Corn Belt this morning, particularly in the upper Great Lakes region, moving into portions of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. It's going to take time, but we'll have to wait and see if there was any damage to some of the early planted corn. And some of that corn went in very early in the month of March. For us proper, we do have a chance for freezing conditions, at least in the Panhandle, as we go through this weekend. And then some of those freezing conditions may return to portions of eastern Nebraska, particularly later into the next week. So let's take a look at the upper air model and see what we have going. Here's our energy that's now moving off the eastern seaboard. And we look into the west as this trough starts to move over top of this ridge. It's going to drive a cold front at the surface through our region. We'll be looking at the chance for scattered thunderstorm activity developing in western Nebraska this afternoon, and then that will move across the state and exit eastern Nebraska sometime during the morning hours tomorrow. Right now the models are indicating about a 1/4 inch general coverage across eastern Nebraska. We may see some heavier precipitation in isolated cells, but overall the speed of the system moving through the state is likely to limit the amount of moisture we will get from it. And as the system pulls over top of the ridge, we are going to start to see cold air filtering in. So as we go into tomorrow, we're going to be looking at highs that are going to drop into the upper 50s across the north, and across the south we'll be looking at the upper 50s, and that system will move toward the Great Lakes on Sunday, and we will start to see some ridging and warmer air try to move into our region. So we're going to look a bump up in temperatures to the upper 50s, low 60s across the north. As we get to the southern border region, we'll be looking at highs in the mid to upper 60s, and the cold air will move into the Great Lakes and start developing a pretty significant trough. So by the time we get to Monday, you'll see that the cold air is sweeping through the Dakotas into the eastern Great Lakes, and that means that we'll see a repeat of frost conditions. For northeastern Nebraska, there is a possibility that some of this cold air will start to move in as early as Monday evening and give us some scattered frost conditions as we go into Tuesday morning. But for the remainder of eastern Nebraska, our better chance of freezing conditions will be as we go into Wednesday morning. As this cold air starts to dig and push back toward the west, we'll be looking at highs in the northeast in the low 50s, the low 60s across the west, with some scattered frost again possible across eastern Nebraska, particularly Wednesday morning. And you will see that then as we get into the afternoon of Wednesday, the ridge starts to redevelop, pushing that cold air to our east, a return to warmer conditions, upper 50s to low 70s. A warm front moves through, the chance of precipitation, and we'll start to see an upper air low trying to make its way out, which may give us a decent shot of moisture as we go into Thursday. Now the 8 to 14 day forecast indicates above normal temperatures returning to the state in terms of precipitation. With that front coming through, we'll be looking more of a normal precipitation pattern for the next Thursday through the following Tuesday.
Thanks, Alex. To see any segments from today or shows you may have missed in the past, you can search our Market Journal YouTube page, or you can download the new Market Journal mobile app available in the iTunes and Google Play stores. Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets, and we'll take a look at a recent Nebraska trade visit to South Korea. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.